It was one of those quiet, still nights when everything outside seemed to be sleeping. The kind of night where even the usual sounds of crickets and distant traffic felt softer, as if the whole neighborhood had paused for a moment. Streetlights cast a faint glow on the empty roads, and the cool air carried a sense of calm that few people noticed. But for one family, this calm was about to be broken in a way they would never forget. In a modest house at the end of a small suburban street lived a couple who had built their life around simple routines. The husband, a hard-working man and a law enforcement officer, had spent his day serving the community. His wife, a caring and gentle woman, had spent her evening preparing for the next day, finishing small chores and finally settling in for some rest. Their home was quiet, safe and comfortable, or so they thought. Around midnight, the neighborhood was unusually silent. Windows were shut, doors locked, and most houses had lights dimmed for sleep. Yet, despite this ordinary setting, something unusual stirred in the air. Outside, faint shadows moved under the streetlights, signaling that this night would be anything but ordinary. The woman, sitting alone in her living room, felt an unshakable sense that something was about to happen. It was a feeling she couldn't explain, almost like a whisper in her mind telling her to stay alert. Suddenly, the quiet was pierced by the unmistakable sound of police cars pulling into the street. The engines hummed, tires crunching softly over gravel, and the lights flashed, illuminating the walls and trees around the house. It wasn't a common occurrence for officers to come by at such an hour, and the woman's heart started racing. Fear mingled with confusion. Why would they be here at midnight? What could have possibly gone wrong? She moved closer to the window, peering through the curtains, her hands trembling slightly. Her eyes caught the figures of officers stepping out of the cars, their movements quick and purposeful. There was something about the way they moved that made her uneasy. It wasn't the calm, professional demeanor she had seen in her husband or during routine encounters. This was different, urgent, forceful, and tense. Her mind raced, trying to think of any possible explanation, but nothing seemed to make sense. Inside the house, the atmosphere shifted. The air felt heavier, filled with a mix of fear and anticipation. Every small sound, the creak of a floorboard, the rustle of the curtains, even her own breath, seemed amplified in the silence of the night. She could almost feel the tension pressing down on her chest, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath in fear of what was about to happen. While the neighborhood slept, oblivious to what was unfolding, she tried to stay calm. She reminded herself to remain polite, to speak carefully, and to not provoke the officers in any way. But the fear was growing. Her mind started spinning with questions. Were they here for her? Did something happen to her husband? Should she call him? Could she even safely do that? Every scenario seemed scarier than the last, and she realized just how vulnerable she was alone in her house in the middle of the night. Outside, the officers approached with a seriousness that made it clear this was not a routine visit. The flashing lights bounced against the walls, casting shifting shadows that made the living room feel smaller, almost claustrophobic. The quiet calm of the night had been replaced with tension, the kind that makes a person freeze in place, uncertain of what will come next. In that moment, time seemed to slow. Every sound, every movement, every breath felt magnified. The woman's pulse raced, and she felt an overwhelming mix of fear, confusion, and disbelief. She had lived in this neighborhood for years and had always felt safe, especially knowing her husband was a law enforcement officer. But now, safety felt like an illusion, slipping further away with each step the officers took toward her door. Little did she know, this night would change her life in ways she could never have imagined. The quiet, peaceful midnight that had once felt comforting had transformed into a moment of unimaginable tension. Every second counted, every choice mattered, and the sense of dread she felt was only the beginning of an ordeal that would leave her shaken, both physically and emotionally. Even as she tried to steady herself, she knew that whatever was about to happen would not just affect her, it would ripple through her family, her neighborhood, and anyone who would hear this story later. The ordinary, sleepy night had become the backdrop for something extraordinary in the worst sense, setting the stage for a shocking encounter that no one could have predicted. The knock on the door came suddenly, sharp and insistent, slicing through the silence of the night like a warning. At first, she froze, unsure whether to answer or pretend she hadn't heard. Her heart pounded against her chest as a wave of unease washed over her. Who could be knocking at this hour? The neighborhood had always been quiet, and no one ever disturbed them this late. Something didn't feel right. Taking a deep breath, she approached the door, trying to calm herself, reminding herself to stay composed. Her hand hovered over the doorknob, trembling slightly. She peeked through the peephole and saw the unmistakable uniforms of police officers. Panic surged immediately. Police at midnight? Alone? Her mind raced with questions and fears. She considered calling her husband, but he was out of town on duty for a training session. There was no one else to turn to. She opened the door just slightly, enough to speak without letting anyone enter. "Yes. Can I help you?" she asked, her voice shaking despite her attempt to sound calm. The officers didn't smile or greet her politely. Their expressions were stern, their eyes cold and calculating. One of them spoke, voice clipped and impatient. They demanded entry into the house, insisting that they had a matter to investigate. There was no explanation, no warning, only orders. She tried to reason with them, explaining that no one had done anything wrong and that they were at home peacefully. But her words seemed to vanish into the night, unheard or ignored. The officer's tone grew more forceful. The sense of danger that had been creeping along her spine turned into a tight knot of fear. She realized that this wasn't going to be a polite conversation. It was a confrontation, and she was on the defensive. Inside, the atmosphere felt thick and suffocating. Every corner of the living room seemed to close in around her. The officers stepped closer, their boots scraping softly against the floor as they entered without proper invitation. The familiar warmth of her home, the space that had always been her safe haven, felt suddenly foreign, even hostile. The security of her walls and locked doors no longer mattered. It was as though the threat had followed them inside. As she tried to maintain composure, she noticed the officers moving in unison, scanning the room with the practiced precision of people trained to look for threats. Every gesture, every glance was measured and deliberate. She could feel their suspicion directed at her, though she had done nothing wrong. She realized then the terrifying truth: she was completely vulnerable. Alone. Surrounded. Fear gave way to a strange, sharp clarity. She needed to survive this encounter. Every movement had to be cautious, every word carefully chosen. She told herself not to panic, not to scream, not to resist, no matter how unjust or unfair the situation was. She had learned from her husband's advice. In tense situations with law enforcement, staying calm was often the only shield. Yet even as she followed these internal rules, the officers' behavior grew more unpredictable. Their voices, once clipped, started rising in volume. Commands were shouted, accusations flung without explanation. She felt a rush of helplessness, a powerless anger that made her chest tighten and her hands shake. She wanted to defend herself, to shout back, to demand an answer, but she knew it could make things worse. Time seemed to stretch painfully. Each second was heavy, charged with tension, with fear that any moment could erupt into violence. The night, which had started as ordinary, had become an arena where she had no control, where the rules she had always lived by no longer applied. She felt a chilling sense of isolation, knowing that no one could intervene, that the officer's authority gave them a terrifying edge. Amidst the chaos, she noticed small details: the badges gleaming under the dim lights, the stiff posture of the officers, the subtle signals they exchanged with one another. She realized she was being assessed, judged, categorized. Every expression on her face, every word she spoke, was scrutinized. It was as if they were trying to see if she would falter, if fear would make her slip, if she would give them a reason to act. And then something deep inside her shifted. A quiet resolve emerged from beneath the fear. She reminded herself that she had rights, that she was not invisible, and that her husband's service to the community had given them a certain dignity, even if they didn't know it yet. She held her head high, spoke firmly yet politely, and refused to show total submission. It was a delicate balance, fear tempered with courage. Little did she know this standoff was only the beginning. The officer's initial aggression had not yet reached its peak, and what would follow would test her strength, resilience, and presence of mind in ways she had never imagined. But in this first encounter, alone in her living room at midnight, she had already shown that even in the face of fear, she was not completely powerless. The tension in the room had reached a breaking point. What began as an intimidating presence had quickly escalated into something far more dangerous. The woman stood in the living room, her heart hammering in her chest, every nerve on edge. Her hands shook slightly, but she tried to maintain her composure, hoping that politeness and calm words could diffuse the situation. For a brief moment, she clung to the hope that reason might prevail. But reason was not what the officers had come for. One of them suddenly lunged forward, shoving her lightly at first, as if testing her reaction. Shock rippled through her body like an electric current. She stumbled back, nearly tripping over the edge of the carpet. "Please stop. I haven't done anything," she cried, her voice trembling with both fear and disbelief. Instead of stepping back, the officers closed the distance. Their faces were stern, hard, almost void of empathy. Commands were shouted, voices echoing in the small space, though none made sense. It wasn't clear why this was happening, why she was being targeted, or what she could possibly do to make it stop. The confusion only added to the terror. Then the assault began in earnest. She felt a sharp, painful blow across her arm, followed by another to her shoulder. Each strike was disorienting, making it harder to think, harder to stand firm. The physical pain was immediate, but the emotional impact, the humiliation, the fear, the helplessness, was even more unbearable. She had always believed that her home was a sanctuary, a place where she could feel safe, protected by the walls and locks she trusted. But now, that illusion had been violently shattered. The officers' movements were aggressive, almost mechanical, as if they were carrying out a rehearsed procedure rather than responding to a human being. She tried to shield herself, to block the blows, but she was unprepared and overwhelmed. Panic surged through her. Tears blurred her vision, but she refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break entirely. Survival instincts kicked in. She ducked, twisted, and tried to retreat toward the door, hoping for some way out, any escape from the nightmare that had become her living room. At that moment, the quiet neighborhood outside seemed impossibly far away. The distant hum of the streetlights, the occasional bark of a dog, even the soft wind in the trees felt disconnected from the violence unfolding inside the house. In that room there was only her, the officers, and the relentless, terrifying energy of the assault. Every second stretched longer than it should, as if time itself had slowed to make her fear last as long as possible. Through the chaos, she noticed small details that only heightened the horror. The officers' badges glinted coldly under the dim ceiling light. Their eyes were hard, unyielding, showing no compassion. The sound of fists hitting flesh, shoes scraping the floor, and her own panicked breathing filled the room with a terrifying rhythm. Every movement seemed unpredictable, and yet there was a precision to their aggression that made it all the more frightening. She screamed, not just for help but out of sheer disbelief. The injustice of the moment was overwhelming. She couldn't understand why this was happening to her, why a routine night in her home had turned into a scene of violence. Her mind flashed to her husband. What would he think if he could see this? What could he do to stop it? And yet, she was alone, defenseless, trapped in a nightmare that seemed impossible to escape. Even as the pain and fear threatened to overwhelm her, a small part of her mind clung to clarity. She remembered the lessons her husband had always shared about keeping composure in dangerous situations. She reminded herself to breathe, to think, to survive. Every instinct screamed to fight back, but she knew that doing so could make things far worse. Instead, she tried to remain steady, focusing on each breath, each movement, each chance to protect herself from further harm. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, a shift occurred. One of the officers' eyes caught something on the wall, a small shining object, framed and hanging above the fireplace. The blows slowed, the aggression faltered. There was a pause, a brief moment where the assault ceased, as if something unseen had altered the course of events. It was a small reprieve, but in that instant, it was enough for her to gather herself, to steady her body, and to brace for whatever would come next. The assault had been brutal, terrifying, and surreal. Her body ached, her mind reeled, but she survived. The fear, however, lingered. She knew the night was far from over, that the officer's presence in her home still posed a threat, and that the next moments could be even more critical. Yet within her, a spark of determination had been ignited, a quiet resolve that, no matter what happened, she would endure. The room fell into a tense silence, a brief pause that felt almost unreal. The sudden halt in the officer's aggression caught her off guard, leaving her both relieved and more alert than ever. Her breathing, still rapid from the assault, began to settle into shallow, cautious gasps. She couldn't understand what had caused the sudden change. Had she said something wrong or perhaps something right? Her mind raced, trying to read the expressions of the officers, searching for a clue, a sign, anything that could explain the shift in their demeanor. And then she saw it, the glimmer of light reflecting off something on the wall above the fireplace. Her eyes widened and her heart skipped a beat. It was a badge, framed carefully and displayed like a trophy. The husband's badge. The very symbol of his service, his authority, and the respect he had earned through years of law enforcement work. Her stomach twisted in a mix of hope and fear, unsure whether the badge would protect her or provoke further scrutiny. The officers noticed it too. One of them paused mid-step, their hand frozen in the air as their eyes fixed on the shining emblem. The room felt heavier suddenly, charged with a different kind of energy, a subtle but unmistakable shift in power. Where moments ago there had been unchecked aggression, there was now hesitation, a flicker of uncertainty. They stiffened, their previously confident movements slowing as if they were weighing a new reality they hadn't anticipated. In that pause, she could feel the balance of the room change. The small badge on the wall, a simple symbol of law and duty, had become a shield. It radiated authority, demanding respect in a way that nothing else in the room could. The officers, despite their initial aggression, were now confronted with a reminder of the very structure they themselves upheld. It was a strange, almost surreal reversal. The ones who had wielded fear were now momentarily caught in it themselves, unsure how to proceed. She remained perfectly still, careful not to break the fragile moment of pause. Every muscle in her body was tense, ready to react if the situation shifted again. Her mind was racing faster than ever. She realized the importance of this instant. It was her chance, perhaps the only one, to influence what happened next. She didn't know if speaking or moving would help, but she trusted that the silent power of her husband's badge could buy her a moment, a critical moment, to survive. The officer's eyes lingered on the badge, and she noticed the subtle signals between them. A tilt of the head, a narrowed gaze, a brief whisper. Their body language had changed completely. The confidence they had projected when they first entered the room was replaced by caution and hesitation. They were no longer the aggressors in full control. The badge had reminded them that authority and respect could shift in an instant. In that suspended moment, she could almost see the thought process playing out behind their eyes. They were evaluating, reassessing, questioning their actions. The room was still, but it was no longer safe for them to act recklessly. She had survived the initial assault, but this turning point was critical. It was the line between chaos and order, between further violence and potential de-escalation. The emotional weight of the situation pressed down on her. Relief mixed with lingering fear, and she realized how close she had come to being powerless. The badge wasn't just metal. It was a symbol of the life her husband had dedicated himself to, a symbol of authority, of training, of justice. And in that moment, it served as her lifeline, bridging the terrifying gap between vulnerability and protection. As the officer stood frozen, the woman gathered her strength. She steadied her trembling hands, took a deeper breath, and readied herself for the next moment. She didn't know what would happen next, but the pause had given her clarity. She had survived the first wave of danger, and now the balance of power had shifted, if only slightly. She had learned that even in the face of fear and aggression, symbols of authority and respect could alter the course of events in profound ways. It was a turning point she would never forget. A moment when a simple badge, a reminder of duty and honor, had the power to change the course of an encounter that could have ended in tragedy. And as the officer stood stiff, unsure, and cautious, she realized that the night was far from over, but the odds had subtly shifted in her favor. The sudden pause in the room felt almost surreal, as if the air itself had thickened and time had slowed. The woman, still trembling from the earlier assault, could hardly believe the shift that had just occurred. The officers, who had moments ago been aggressive, relentless, and intimidating, now seemed frozen, stiff, uncertain, and awkward in a way that was almost unnatural. Their eyes, once cold and focused on her, now flickered between the badge on the wall and each other, as if silently asking, "What do we do now?" She took a cautious step backward, trying not to make any sudden movements that could reignite their hostility. Her heart raced, not from fear alone, but from a strange mixture of relief and disbelief. The same officers who had beaten her moments before were now visibly hesitant, their confidence replaced with caution. She realized the badge had done more than halt the assault. It had forced them to confront a reality they hadn't expected. In that instant, authority and respect had taken on a physical presence in the room, embodied in that small, framed symbol of her husband's service. The silence was heavy, almost deafening. Every second seemed to stretch on endlessly as the officers struggled to regain control of a situation that had suddenly shifted beneath their feet. Their bodies were stiff, their movements calculated but hesitant. Hands that had moments ago been ready to strike now hovered uncertainly at their sides. Voices, once loud and commanding, had diminished to quiet murmurs, barely audible above the woman's shallow, uneven breaths. She could see the internal conflict etched across their faces. One officer's jaw tightened, eyes narrowing as he attempted to reconcile the scene before him with the reality of the badge on the wall. Another shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his partner as if seeking guidance, silently asking, "How do we proceed?" It was clear, they had not anticipated this moment, and now the aggression that had fueled their actions had been replaced by an almost tangible confusion. In the midst of the tense pause, the woman felt a small spark of control. She wasn't yet safe, but she had witnessed a fundamental shift in the dynamic. For the first time since the officers had entered, she realized that they were no longer completely in command. The power that had been entirely one-sided, threatening, violent, and oppressive, was now at least partially shared. The badge had reminded them of her connection to law enforcement, a fact that changed the calculation of risk, authority, and consequence. Her mind raced with thoughts of what might come next. Would the officers retreat? Would they regain composure and resume their aggression? Or would this pause give her the chance to protect herself, to take a step toward safety? Every possibility felt equally fragile, and the weight of uncertainty pressed down on her. She reminded herself to remain calm, to move deliberately, and to use this moment wisely. The difference between survival and further harm could hinge on a single decision, a single gesture, a single word. Meanwhile, the officer's body language spoke volumes. One of them shifted uneasily, his feet planted firmly but his shoulders tense, as though preparing for a decision he wasn't ready to make. Another's eyes lingered on the badge as if searching for an explanation or justification. Even the subtle exchange of glances between them revealed a shared understanding. The previous certainty of their authority had evaporated, replaced by doubt and hesitation. They were no longer simply enforcers of power. They were humans confronted with a scenario that challenged their expectations and forced them to reckon with respect and accountability. For the woman, the experience was both terrifying and empowering. She had been battered and frightened, yet now she could see a path forward, however narrow. The aggression had paused, giving her a rare and invaluable moment to breathe, to steady herself, and to assess the room, the officers, and the situation with clarity she had lacked before. The physical pain remained, the shock remained, but the psychological shift, the realization that she had, in some way, influenced the encounter, was undeniable. And yet, even in that moment of precarious relief, the tension lingered. The night was far from over, and while the badge had changed the dynamic, it had not ended the danger. The officers remained in the house, their presence a reminder of the risk that still existed. Every muscle in her body remained ready, every thought alert to the possibility of sudden violence. She knew that survival depended on careful observation, measured reactions, and the ability to anticipate what might happen next. In that suspended, heavy silence, the room seemed to hold its breath. The officer's stiffening had created a fragile equilibrium, a brief pause in a storm that could resume at any moment. The woman understood that this turning point was critical. It was the line between continued assault and potential de-escalation. And as she watched them, frozen, cautious, and uncertain, she realized that this night would leave a lasting mark not only on her body and mind, but also on the understanding of power, respect, and fear. The night had finally begun to settle, though the air in the house was still thick with tension. The officers, having frozen at the sight of the badge, now moved toward the door, their pace slow and deliberate, as if reluctant to leave yet unable to continue the confrontation. The woman stood in the middle of her living room, her body aching from the earlier assault, her mind spinning with shock, confusion, and the heavy weight of relief. She was alive, but the safety of her home, the sanctuary she had always relied upon, felt shattered. The silence after the officer's retreat was almost deafening. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant sound outside, seemed to echo unnaturally in the quiet house. She remained still, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly, as if any sudden noise might bring the danger back. Her body was bruised and sore, and the emotional impact, the humiliation, fear, and adrenaline, left her trembling in ways she hadn't expected. It wasn't just the physical pain that haunted her. It was the sudden, terrifying realization of vulnerability, the knowledge that her safety could be stripped away in an instant. She walked slowly toward the nearest wall to steady herself, pressing her hand against the doorframe. The living room, which had always been a place of comfort and warmth, now looked different, foreign, unsafe, as if it carried the memory of the assault in every shadow and corner. The quiet ticking of the clock felt unusually loud, marking each second as a reminder of what had just happened. She could hardly believe that in this very room just moments ago she had been physically overpowered, her home violated, and her sense of security shattered. As she surveyed the room, she began to notice the subtle reminders of the chaos that had unfolded. A chair had been knocked over, a lamp slightly tilted, and the carpet bore faint marks from the struggle. Each small detail replayed the horror in her mind, making it difficult to separate the past from the present. The experience had left an invisible scar on the room and on her. She realized that while the officers had left, the aftermath would linger for far longer than a single night. Her thoughts quickly turned to her husband, imagining his reaction if he were home to witness the aftermath. She felt a surge of fear and urgency. What would he think seeing his wife bruised, shaken, and terrified? But even in the midst of panic, a sense of resolve began to form. She knew that he would want her to document what had happened, to make sure this injustice was not ignored. She would need to summon the courage to recount the events, to confront the trauma, and to ensure that accountability followed. Reaching for her phone, her hands still trembling, she hesitated. Every instinct screamed caution. Who could she call? Who could she trust? She knew that the world outside her home was filled with both help and potential danger. Finally, with careful movements, she dialed the number of a close friend, someone who would come immediately and provide support. Speaking through trembling words, she explained as calmly as she could what had happened, feeling a small sense of relief knowing she wasn't entirely alone. As the minutes passed, the adrenaline that had fueled her moments before began to ebb, leaving behind exhaustion that seeped into her bones. She collapsed onto the couch, her mind racing with questions and fears. How could this have happened? Why had the officers acted with such aggression? And yet, the glimmer of hope remained. The moment of hesitation caused by the badge had saved her from further harm. It was a reminder of the strange, unpredictable ways that power, respect, and fear can intersect. Even as she sat there, physically and emotionally drained, she could feel the ripple effects of the night settling in. Her thoughts wandered to the larger implications. The fear of encountering law enforcement in vulnerable moments, the reality of racial bias, and the unpredictable nature of power. She realized that this incident wasn't just a personal ordeal, it was a reflection of a wider social problem, one that affected countless others who might not have been as fortunate to survive with their lives and dignity intact. By the time the first light of dawn filtered through the curtains, she had begun to regain a fraction of her composure. The officers were gone, but the emotional scars remained, as did the pressing need to take action. She knew that documenting the incident, seeking medical attention, and sharing the story with those who could help were the next critical steps. This night, which had started like any other, had turned into a turning point in her life. A night that would forever change her understanding of vulnerability, resilience, and justice. The aftermath was both sobering and empowering. While fear and trauma lingered, so did a newfound strength. The understanding that survival, courage, and the will to demand accountability could exist even in the most harrowing moments. She realized that while the assault had left its marks, it had also revealed her inner resolve and the protective power of truth, preparation, and courage. The night was over, but its impact would echo for a lifetime. When the husband returned home the next morning, he had no idea what had transpired during the long, terrifying night. He had been away on duty, trusting that his wife was safe in the house they had built together, a place he always thought of as a sanctuary. But as he pulled into the driveway, something felt off. The quiet stillness of the morning didn't feel peaceful, it felt heavy, almost oppressive. He noticed small, unusual details immediately: the front door slightly ajar, a chair that wasn't in its usual place, and faint, unsettling marks on the doormat. A growing unease settled in his chest as he stepped inside. "Honey?" he called, his voice a mix of hope and concern. There was no immediate response, only the subtle creak of floorboards beneath his feet. He moved carefully through the house, scanning each room, and then he saw her, his wife, sitting on the couch, her body tense, her hands trembling slightly, eyes wide and haunted. His heart sank. He rushed to her side, kneeling in front of her, taking in the visible bruises on her arms and shoulders, the small cuts, and the way she flinched even at his gentle touch. What happened?" he asked, voice breaking with both fear and anger. The sight of his wife, the woman he loved and trusted to be safe under his roof, battered and frightened, ignited a mixture of fury and disbelief that he had never experienced before. As she recounted the events of the night, the aggressive knock, the sudden intrusion, the physical assault, and the moment of hesitation caused by his badge, he listened in stunned silence. Each word hit him like a blow, and yet he felt a quiet, growing sense of pride at the bravery she had shown under such terrifying circumstances. Despite her fear, she had remained composed enough to survive, even when the officers had been violent and unpredictable. Anger coursed through him in waves. How could those officers have violated his home, hurt his wife, and acted with such reckless disregard for her safety? Every detail of the encounter replayed vividly in his mind, making it impossible to hold back the rage that surged within him. He clenched his fists, jaw tight, and struggled to keep his voice steady as he tried to focus on what needed to be done next. This wasn't just about emotion, it was about justice, accountability, and protecting his family. Even as the fury burned, a sense of responsibility tempered his reaction. He knew that reacting impulsively or aggressively could complicate the situation further. Instead, he focused on documenting the assault, calling authorities, and gathering evidence. Photos of the injuries, notes of the events, and witness statements would be critical in holding those responsible accountable. He knew that the officer's hesitation during the incident, triggered by his badge, could serve as a key detail in demonstrating the influence of authority and the need for accountability. While he helped his wife to her feet and led her gently to the kitchen for water, he also reassured her, trying to provide comfort and stability. The emotional toll was evident. Fear lingered in her eyes, and every sound from outside made her flinch. He held her, telling her that she had done everything right, that her survival was the most important thing, and that together, they would ensure that the injustice she had endured did not go unanswered. In the hours that followed, he made several calls to friends, colleagues, and legal advisors, carefully building a network of support. He wanted to ensure that the incident was documented thoroughly and that the officers involved were held responsible. Beyond personal justice, he felt a deeper responsibility to raise awareness about such incidents, particularly the dangers and abuses that can occur when authority is exercised recklessly. The husband's reaction was a combination of anger, protectiveness, determination, and empathy. He had always respected the law and upheld it himself, but seeing his wife subjected to harm by those entrusted with authority shook him to the core. It reminded him of the fragility of safety, the importance of vigilance, and the unpredictable nature of fear. Yet, through the anger, he also recognized the bravery of his wife, the power of the badge on the wall, and the small but critical ways in which courage and respect can shift the course of dangerous situations. By the end of the morning, he had transformed his initial shock and rage into purposeful action. The incident had revealed vulnerabilities, injustices, and gaps in accountability, but it had also highlighted resilience, the importance of preparation, and the strength of facing danger with composure. Together, he and his wife began to navigate the path toward recovery, understanding that this event would leave lasting scars, but also lessons in courage, vigilance, and the power of standing firm in the face of aggression. In the days that followed, the story of that harrowing midnight encounter began to settle in the minds of the woman and her husband, and slowly, it began to resonate beyond the walls of their home. The immediate danger had passed, yet the emotional and psychological aftermath lingered like a shadow, impossible to ignore. She still flinched at sudden noises, her body still bore the marks of the assault, and every time she closed her eyes, the memory of that night replayed vividly. But alongside fear, there was clarity, an understanding of vulnerability, resilience, and the subtle power of courage in moments of crisis. The incident did not remain private for long. As the couple shared their experience with close friends and family, word began to spread. Conversations started to emerge about the unpredictability of encounters with law enforcement, the impact of racial bias, and the fine line between authority and abuse. The badge on the wall, the symbol of law, service, and respect, had become the turning point that saved her from further harm, but it also became a symbol of a deeper truth, that accountability and oversight are crucial in maintaining justice, and that no one should ever feel powerless in their own home. Community members, activists, and online audiences reacted with a mixture of outrage, empathy, and concern. Many recognized the broader implications of the story. The incident was not just a personal ordeal but a reflection of systemic issues that affect countless others. Discussions arose about the importance of reporting misconduct, advocating for victims, and creating safeguards that prevent abuse of authority. The couple's story highlighted the fragility of safety and the importance of speaking out, reminding society that silence can allow injustice to thrive. The husband, a law enforcement officer himself, used his professional insight to emphasize the lessons learned. He explained that training, respect for authority, and adherence to ethical conduct are essential not only for officers but for the protection of the public. Yet he also acknowledged the painful reality. Even those who serve to protect can act recklessly, and systemic accountability must exist to prevent such incidents. His perspective added credibility and weight to the narrative, bridging personal experience with broader social awareness. For the woman, the incident became a source of both trauma and empowerment. She had survived a terrifying ordeal, endured physical and emotional pain, and faced the unimaginable fear of being attacked in her own home. Yet, she also discovered an inner strength she had never fully recognized before. The pause caused by the badge, the moment when fear and respect intersected, had not only protected her but had demonstrated that courage and composure can influence outcomes even in the most dire circumstances. The story sparked dialogue about safety, vigilance, and the ways in which ordinary citizens can protect themselves in encounters with authority. It raised questions about how society perceives power, the role of respect and recognition, and the impact of racial dynamics in law enforcement interactions. Each conversation, each share, Each comment online reinforced the importance of raising awareness and demanding accountability, transforming a personal nightmare into a powerful lesson for a wider audience. Ultimately, the incident left an indelible mark, not just on the woman and her husband, but on the community that witnessed, discussed, and reflected on it. It became a story of survival, a cautionary tale about vulnerability, and a testament to the courage that ordinary people can summon when faced with extraordinary danger. The midnight assault, the fear, and the turning point at the badge all combined into a narrative that highlighted resilience, the need for justice, and the critical role of societal awareness in preventing abuse. As the couple continued to rebuild their sense of safety and normalcy, they carried with them the lessons of that night. They understood that their experience was both deeply personal and profoundly universal, a reminder that authority must always be exercised with care, that vigilance is necessary for self-protection, and that courage, composure, and truth can, in their own way, change the course of even the most terrifying encounters. The story lingered not only in their hearts but in the consciousness of everyone who heard it, serving as both a warning and a call to action, a call to ensure that no one has to face such fear alone.